Welcome to our seventh and final forum for the lecture series In the Spirit, Christian Reflections on the Entity Dilemma. Our guest today is Vladimir Miskovic, whose talk is titled Mapping the Deep Spaces of the Mind, a Christian Anthropological Lens. It's probably fair to say that the phenomenon of entity encounters in psychedelics shines a spotlight on a larger concern, our ambivalence and lack of fluency when it comes to thinking about the spiritual world with modern minds. How should a rationally minded, scientifically informed, modern Christian understand the spiritual dimension of reality? Are there ways we might need to loosen our grip on what we think we know, or aspects of our faith we thought we could dismiss or turn to metaphor that we might need to reconsider? There are all kinds of very practical, pastoral, and therapeutic issues when it comes to entities and psychedelics. What resources do we have to help prepare people, to keep them spiritually safe? And who is qualified to use those resources, especially in a secular clinical context? But those practical questions point us to this bigger issue, which is a need to learn how to think and speak and pray about spiritual and material realities in a more integrated way. We've covered a remarkable amount of territory in the course of these talks, including teasing out some of the philosophical and psychospiritual questions with Brian McGowan, how to anchor our understanding and practice in Scripture with New Testament scholar Jamie Clark Souls, and discernment and the psychology of the Desert Fathers with Orthodox priest and scholar Father Jeffrey Reddy. Then in talks 4 through 6, we shifted to explore different contemporary modes of practice, some in and some outside of the Christian tradition, to see what we might learn from them. That included a panel discussion on charismatic Christianity, a talk from Signe Goldman, who is both a psychiatrist and neo-shamanic practitioner, and Bill Barnard, a scholar practitioner in Santo Daime. Today is an attempt to close the loop, to return to the deep resources of Christian faith in such a way that honors scientific understanding, modern psychological insights, and reasonable philosophical commitments. That is, it's intended to help us become more fluent in the grammar of Christian faith, along with modern ways of knowing and not despite them. Dr. Vladimir Miskovic is a neuroscientist, former professor of psychology, and former novice monk. He's the author of Dreaming Reality and currently investigates the neurological and psychological effects of contemplative practice at the Non-Duality Institute in Woodstock. Vladimir has offered guest lectures and presentations on psychosomatic and psychospiritual models of contemplative practice at Brown University, the Catholic University of America, Trinity College and the University of Toronto, and Western Washington University, as well as at various private organizations. Vladimir weaves together the latest findings in contemplative neuroscience and psychology with centuries-old wisdom of the Christian tradition and other sacred paths. His work is dedicated to fostering a dynamic, non-reductive understanding of the whole human being, providing a grounded yet transformative vision for navigating the modern world. In just a moment, I'll post in the chat a glossary of terms and a document on discernment intended to help us follow along and have some notes to refer back to later on. Vlad will speak for about an hour, followed by Q&A. If you have questions that come up while he's speaking, please feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll keep the chat free of chatter so that it's not a distraction. You're also more than welcome to raise your digital hand and ask a question directly during the Q&A when we get there, if you prefer. I'll finish now with a short reading from St. Nikolai Velimirovich that I hope will root us in some of the themes I imagine will come up today, followed by a brief prayer, and then Vlad, you can take it from there. Your soul is the cradle of the living God. Your heart is God's throne. Your mind is Mount Sinai, where God alone gives tablets of stone and speaks. Journey freely with God within you. You will not lose the way, and you will not be left without shelter. Enter with God freely through the gates of the day, and the day will be yours, enter with God freely through the gates of the night, and the night will cringe with its specters and will show you its wonders. Do not sell your treasure, for the world cannot pay for it. Do not trade with the universe, for the universe can give nothing except itself. Space from one end to the other cannot store your treasure. Time from one end to the other cannot calculate your treasure. Let us pray. Holy and gracious God, through your wisdom you created us. In your love you choose to dwell within us, and by your mercy you do not leave us to our own devices. Set us free from every snare that entangles, that we may discover that to be aligned with your love is to be aligned with our truest selves. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Okay, Vlad, all yours.
Thank you, Megan. That was lovely. And how wonderful to hear Saint Nikolai Velimirovich there, one of my favorites. I think actually some of what that reading alluded to in terms of the interrelation between the universe and the human being is definitely going to be coming up a lot here. So I've enjoyed speaking to Megan about when she asked me to do this topic, because when she told me the theme of the forum was entities, I thought, why me? That's not really my wheelhouse. I don't really spend a lot of my time thinking about entities. But then I reflected more deeply, and then I thought, well, in a way I don't, in a way I do. Because as you'll see, many of these sort of adjacent topics are very, very close and dear to me. And so, in the spirit of all being interrelated, in the process of coming up with this talk, I realized that I had some thoughts to share about this whole entity dilemma, as you've been calling it. And I'm going to be presenting you today with a perspective that is maybe not what you will encounter in modern neuroscience, which is one that takes these entities to be ontologically real phenomena. And I will hopefully present you with a framework that allows you to see how that could at least be reasonable within a scientific framework and not totally insane. So I thought it would be good to start off with the reviewing some of the phenomenology of these extremely unusual experiences, I think it's fair to say, that can be elicited by the range of classical psychedelics as well as other non-psychedelic experiences like deep prayer, near-death experiences, and so on. But unrivaled among all psychedelic substances, as I'm sure you all know, in terms of the reliability with which it elicits these so-called entity encounters is, of course, DMT. So I'll begin with talking about a little bit about DMT. We know that after it is administered, it initiates an epistemic and phenomenological rupture that is unparalleled compared to almost anything else. So it functions a lot less like a traditional hallucinogen and more as a catalyst for a sudden total substitution of the subject's whole environmental field. When it's administered via vaporization, most commonly, or through an IV injection, DMT completely bypasses the gradual onset that is typical of other classical psychedelics. It strikes the central nervous system like a freight train, reaching peak effects usually within 5 minutes. By the third inhalation, the boundaries of the ordinary sensorium are completely shattered. And what occurs next is a total reality channel switch. The brain's whole predictive world-building machinery completely abandons the sort of consensus reality, the consensus environment, and constructs an inordinately complex, hyperdimensional world model bearing absolutely no relationship to normal waking reality. The immediate shock of this breakthrough is an overwhelming sense of what is termed hyper-reality. So in phenomenological surveys of user experiences, up to 80% of people report that the DMT realm as feeling more real than everyday waking consciousness. So this produces an acute state of ontological shock, which is sometimes a terrifying realization that everything that the subject previously believed to be true, possible, or real has suddenly been completely obliterated in an instant. Upon breaching the threshold, the psychonaut does not enter into some sort of an empty void, but rather enters into a populated transpersonal ecology. So the hallmark of this breakthrough is encounter with non-human, seemingly autonomous and non-conventional intelligences. Survey data reveal that these entities, which are most commonly categorized as beings, guides, spirits, or helpers, manifest with clear intentionality and specific agendas. In some cases, they appear to be waiting for the subject. Sometimes they are welcoming them back with a profound sense of familiarity, or actively operating on them in what are perceived to be hyper-advanced neurological surgeries. Encounters with specific typologies or archetypal forms, such as elves or giant mantids, populate these spaces with unusual frequency. And the interaction with these beings is usually very deeply immersive and fundamentally non-verbal. So the shock of the breakthrough persists long after the drug's short pharmacological half-life, in some cases permanently altering the subject's metaphysical worldview. Nearly three-quarters of individuals report a sustained belief that these entities that they encountered continue to exist in a different, objective dimension of reality, long after the experience concludes. David Luke has done a lot of naturalistic field studies of psychedelic users, and he finds that the vast majority of them who have experienced these entity encounters reported that the entities seem to possess a, quote, independent sentient existence, unquote. Furthermore, the experience reliably induces a massive paradigm shift. More than half of those who were previously identified as atheists or agnostics prior to the encounter abandoned this identification afterwards, shifting toward the belief in an ultimate reality or a universal divinity. This was the work of Ronald Griffiths when he was still alive at Johns Hopkins University. Ultimately, those people who have ventured into these realms return saying, that was not a dream, whatever I experienced. It was a real place, and someone was with me there. So obviously, it's a pretty staggering phenomenological impact of these substances, of the psychedelic breakthrough. So now we arrive at a kind of epistemological crossroads, and we pose this question: what are these seemingly autonomous, highly non-conventional intelligences, or these entities? And there are basically three broad explanations that dominate the contemporary discourse. The first, which is on the left here in this table, is physical reductionism or physicalist materialism. And in this view, the entities are simply hallucinations that are generated by a brain that is operating under extreme neurological perturbation. So this is a consequence of massive dumping of serotonin and activation of these 5-HT2A serotonin receptors. And these receptors are now running into hyperdrive. So the entities under this interpretation might be dismissed as basically unreal. They're the brain's facial recognition software that is misfiring, generating neurological froth or noise, or what is called hyperapophenia, that has absolutely zero valid ontological meaning. In my view, these purely materialist accounts struggle to even get off the ground, to even explain the basic aspects of this experience. For one, they find it extremely difficult to explain, if it's true that this is simply neural noise, why there is incredible cross-cultural consistency of the archetypal entity forms that are encountered by individuals in different countries and over the span of multiple decades. including before the emergence of the internet and the popularity of internet memes that have popularized things like elves, for example. So these aren't just random hallucinations. They're highly structured and highly consistent. Also, even individuals with aphantasia, which is a complete inability to engage in visual imagination, report that they have had highly convincing sensed presence encounters of interacting with these high agency minds. The second possibility, which I've illustrated in the middle of this table, is what I call psychologism or psychological reductionism, unlike material reductionism. And here, the entities are understood to be real and meaningful, but they remain entirely isolated within the human psyche. They don't have any transcendental reality to them. So they might be archetypal structures, dissociated complexes, or symbolic manifestations of personal or collective unconscious processes. So this perspective does provide some psychological value over and above the purely materialist reductionist view, but it operates as a kind of psychological reductionism that walls off these relational encounters inside an exclusively immanent or subjective frame of reference. The third possibility, which is largely the one that I will try to defend in this talk, or the one that I will try to take, is realism, basically. So this could be called ideal realism. And this is the perspective of most sacred traditions, whether they're Christian or Sufi or shamanistic, which is that there is an ontological reality to many of these intelligences that are encountered. So according to this view, as I'm presenting it, altered states induced by psychedelics do not merely generate interior illusions. Rather, what they do is they disclose dimensions of reality that are normally hidden from our ordinary waking consciousness or awareness. I would say that psychedelics serve as chemical razors of the energetic volume. So they forcefully lower the brain's evolutionary reducing valve, permitting consciousness to expand into a much vaster and more ultimate reality that lies behind appearances. To use the language of Federico Fagin, who's a physicist that I will allude to again later, our ordinary waking reality is a kind of a virtual dashboard, what he calls a P space. And this is detailed in the glossary that I provided. So you can think of it as a sort of user interface that is constructed of classical symbols that are designed to keep biological agents alive, to make sure that you're not that you don't become prey to a predator, for example. But what a breakthrough dose of a psychedelic does is it shatters this symbolic user interface and it drops you, the observer, below these virtual pixels, so to speak, of this dashboard and plunges the experiencing awareness directly into what Federico would say is the quantum source code of reality. And this is a fundamental semantic field filled with meaning that constitutes a kind of shared matrix, which he refers to as I space, information space. And also he refers to this at a deeper level as consciousness space or C space. So I believe psychedelics are directly initiating a person's entry into these deeper, more inward realms of reality. Now, what is striking about this, I think, is that much of the Christian tradition already possesses a very sophisticated conceptual vocabulary for this realistic possibility. Ancient Christian writers did not imagine the human mind as some sort of a sealed container that is cut off from the rest of the cosmos. Rather, they understood consciousness as existing within a larger spiritual ecology that was populated by real intelligences that are capable of directly influencing our thoughts, desires, our imagination, and perception. So to map where these breakthroughs and entity encounters take place, we have to completely, at least for the time being, abandon the kind of flatland ontology of mechanistic materialism and physicalism and turn to what I will call a cosmos psychic map. And I I derived this map from sacred tradition, primarily Christian, but also Vedantic. It is common to both of those. And I deliberately use the term cosmopsychism or cosmopsychic because sacred tradition holds an intrinsically holistic worldview in which cosmology and psychology are completely interlinked. They cannot be separated. And this is a reality that modern secular minds have lost experiential access to almost completely. In late antique and early monastic Christian thought, this relationship between the mind and the cosmos was viewed as deeply interconnected, to the point that cosmology was seen as directly explanatory for human mental and psychological functioning. Unlike modern psychological frameworks that enforce a strict Cartesian divide between the internal self and the external world, ancient monastic authors saw no such boundary. They move effortlessly between the personal, subjective realm of thoughts and the broader cosmic realm of external spiritual realities, demonstrating that their understanding of the self completely embraces both of these spheres. And central to this worldview was the belief that the human mind was essentially an open cosmic intersection, continually acted upon by external cosmic powers. So within this context, traditional demonology served as a highly sophisticated psychological framework. It provided a very powerful way for these thinkers to imagine and explain the constant interaction between an individual's inner mental life and the external causal forces in the universe. Wandering or intrusive thoughts were frequently interpreted as the direct relational imprint of these external forces acting upon the baseline of human awareness. The human mind and the physical structure of the cosmos were seen as inextricably linked by an overarching narrative of spiritual movement, cosmic order, and external influence. The psyche, the human psyche, is a microcosm of the cosmos, and the cosmos is a macrocosm of the psyche. This also carries a very disquieting implication, I think, for us today, which is that as more and more people in our modern world are engaging and beginning to dialogue with these entities through the increased popularity and use of potent psychedelics, and the extent to which these experiences are being handled unskillfully, it is potentially opening the portals to and increasing the spiritual influence of malevolent entities on a collective plane. So these supposedly private experiences, if they're understood from this perspective, are actually sort of like public broadcasts that have ripple effects that may influence other minds that are not directly housed within the skull of that particular individual. Now, to visually map how this macrocosmic structure is organized, the modern physicist Wolfgang Smith provides a very elegant representation known as the cosmic icon, which is what I'm showing you here. And this divides the universe, and by extension, the human being, into three nested ontological domains that perfectly align with this ancient map. So first, there is the corporeal realm, which is the outer shell of this cosmic icon. And this is the physical world of our ordinary waking consciousness state. It is strictly bound and conditioned both by space and by time. At the very core of the cosmic icon, at the very center, is the what Wolfgang Smith calls the AV eternal realm or the spiritual realm. And this is the transcendent, unconditioned ground of being, which is subject neither to space nor time. It is outside of both of those. And in between the corporeal shell and the inner core is what he calls the intermediary realm. This is also known as the psychic realm, also known as the subtle realm, and the realm of the imaginal. So this is a subtle domain that lies between the two. And crucially, this intermediary realm is subject to the condition of time, but it is entirely free from the constraints of space. So that has certain implications that I will go into later. Now, within the theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church, this this realm, the intermediary realm or the subtle realm, is referred to and recognized as the so-called aerial world, the world of the air, the spirits of the air. And this is a domain that is absolutely teeming with principalities and powers, which are non-conventional intelligences. And because this realm lacks spatial boundaries, the entities that are encountered within this realm are capable of manifesting as dynamic, telepathic, and hyperdimensional forms. The Orthodox tradition understands this aerial realm as objectively real and a native habitat for non-human spiritual entities, including demonic as well as angelic forces. Interestingly enough, this intermediary realm is also specifically the ontological arena where most exorcisms are believed to occur. So the renowned author and exorcist, Roman Catholic Father Malachi Martin, referred to this exact domain as the so-called middle plateau, noting that an exorcist must consciously access this intermediary realm of consciousness or awareness or cosmopsychism in order to confront the demonic world directly. So as a whole, the Christian tradition contains some urgent warnings for us. One is that accessing this intermediary realm is potentially profoundly dangerous for those who are spiritually unprepared or enter without adequate guidance or adequate preparation. So whether that happens through occult practices or through the pharmacological aid of a psychedelic substance, entering the aerial world plunges the unprotected human subject into a non-spatial ecology that is inhabited by these highly autonomous and potentially malevolent, but let's say morally ambiguous real agents. Now, to understand how this cosmic icon refers to our inner psychology or the human psyche, and how the human subject navigates the territory, I'm going to map the macrocosmic cosmic icon onto the microcosm of the human psyche. And I'm going to do that just really briefly by invoking the Russian philosopher Boris Vysheslavsev, who was a Russian Orthodox philosopher. And he expanded the traditional tripartite model of the body, soul, and spirit into a very detailed seven-tiered ontological map. Now, there's a lot to this sort of funnel model that I will not have time to go into all of it, but let's just say that in our ordinary waking state, we primarily operate from Vysheslavs's fifth tier, which he called the conscious or animal soul level. And this is an egocentric layer of consciousness that is dominated by personal concerns, survival instincts, these kinds of phenomena. So this is the typical ordinary ego that is operating through a very heavy stack of neuronal filters that carves up a very vast reality into a very measly, tiny trickle that is optimized for personal survival of that particular ego. And this would that layer, the sort of the pinched part of the funnel, would correspond to Wolfgang Schmidt's corporeal external shell in the cosmic icon. Now, when an individual ingests a breakthrough dose of a psychedelic, that chemical acts almost like a drill, a high-powered drill, and it basically forcefully shatters the bounds of that of these egocentric constraints of the fifth tier, and it plunges consciousness directly into the third and fourth tiers. So it drops them into this sort of collective unconscious layer or the archetypal layer. And for all intents and purposes, the collective unconscious is, which most commonly was popularized by Carl Jung, is ontologically synonymous with what we call the intermediary or aerial realm in the previous icon. And this is the potential danger of the psychedelic method because it breaches this intermediary realm by completely bypassing the top layers of this funnel, what Vysheslavsev called the spiritual personality. And the spiritual personality is the objective spiritual intellect, which has been cultivated through contemplative practice. It is a faculty that is required to recognize uh, absolute truth and divine values when we enter these realms. Now, because the psychonaut has forcibly bypassed the subjective faculty, the ego drops into collective unconsciousness or the intermediary realm, completely defenseless and stripped of the spiritual armor that is usually required to withstand the various autonomous agents that are roaming in those realms. As St. Peter warns us in his first epistle, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So basically, we can visualize the human psyche as a vertical funnel or a cylinder. It is enormously broad at the base and at the top, but heavily constricted in this sort of narrow middle zone of consensus reality, which is where we normally operate. The bottom of the funnel opens out into the what we can call the lower biological subconscious, and the top opens up into superconsciousness, or what some people call the spiritual unconscious. People can have glimmers of those upper layers, but in the absence of some sort of a dedicated spiritual or contemplative practice, they have not stabilized access to the superconscious conscious realms, and therefore they're not able to discern their way in entering into the intermediary realms. So if the psychedelic is like I call them chemical razors of energetic volume. It floods the nervous system with energy, and it inflates the soul funnel of the psyche almost like a balloon. So as the volume of the balloon expands, the rubber of the balloon thins, and our transliminal threshold drops. So the membrane between the ordinarily isolated human ego and the rest of the cosmos becomes translucent or see-through. So the room around the balloon that is typically not accessible experientially suddenly becomes visible and accessible. And this makes relational encounters with real external presences, in my view, not only possible, but virtually inevitable. Now, if this intermediary realm is the location, then we need to ask who are these inhabitants that roam in these zones of the sort of cosmopsychic map. And to populate this stratum, I want to turn to a synthesis of two different thinkers who have been sort of influential for me. And one is the ideal realism of the Russian Orthodox philosopher Nikolai Lasky on the left, and I think many of his ideas actually find a profound resonance in the quantum panpsychism of the contemporary thinker and physicist Federico Fagin, whom I alluded to earlier. Lasky argued that the universe is not just a collection of inert physical matter, but actually is a nested hierarchy of what he called substantival agents. These are supraspatial and supratemporal monads. In other words, they're really outside of space and time, but they are endowed with intrinsic creative power and free will. And similarly, Federico conceptualizes reality as a fundamental semantic or meaning field, which is driven by what he calls conscious seities. He believes the sort of quantum field is composed fundamentally of consciousness units. So these are self-conscious quantum fields that are endowed with consciousness, identity, and agency, personal agency. So I don't have time to get into the details of these both of these fascinating thinkers, but basically they help us to conceptualize the universe as a continuous, what I call a pan-experiential ecology of personal agents. What we call physical matter is actually only the outward symbolic manifestation of the inner semantic or meaning level communication between these elementary conscious entities or consciousness units. So in the mineral kingdom, these conscious units that make up the mineral kingdom exchange very highly constrained, simple, elementary meaning kinds of information, and they manifest physically as atoms and molecules. In the plant and animal kingdoms, the lower level conscious agents voluntarily subordinate themselves to a more developed central agent, acting as the organs of a whole biological hierarchy or holarchy. So every biological organism is essentially a vast society of these conscious seities that are governed by a dominant central seity. Now, crucially, because a seity or a substantival agent is a quantum entity, its existence does not depend upon possessing a physical biological body. And Federico, in fact, explicitly acknowledges in his framework that encounters with higher dimensional entities such as angels or disembodied spirits fits perfectly within his theoretical architecture. So these are real seities, real conscious units that are operating beyond our restricted physical projection of space-time that normally situates our ordinary waking consciousness. And to explain how we can possibly interact with these non-material beings, Lasky offers his epistemology of what he calls intuitivism. So Lasky rejects the modern notion that the mind sits inside the skull, looking at just representations of the world. And instead, because the cosmos is consubstantial, completely interconnected, organic whole, everything is, in some sense, contained within everything else. Everything is immanent in everything, Lasky would say. So when the psychedelic disables the usual filtering mechanisms in the nervous system, our what he calls epistemic coordination expands enormously, allowing us to directly contemplate these non-corporeal agents that are operating at these distinct levels of the cosmic hierarchy. At this level, communication becomes telepathic rather than verbal because it is a direct exchange of live semantic meaning within a shared consciousness space. And so it's completely unencumbered by the slow translation into physical symbols or sound waves like the ones I'm producing with my mouth right now. Communication is immediate. I'm going to skip this slide for the sake of time. Okay, so I talked about these, three different models, the physical materialism, the sort of what I call psychological reductionism or psychologism, and then realism, ideal realism. And I would put basically, I would put my hat in the ring with realism, which is the view that I just presented, that these are uh, real agencies, real intelligences. But resolving the whole philosophical debate I think it's fascinating, but we don't have the time for that right now. And we have to be also careful not to get completely bogged down in the metaphysical weeds. So whether you want to, for the sake of the argument, whether these agents, whether you want to classify them as deep sort of psychological projections, or as I'm arguing, independent, objectively existing spiritual monads, I would argue that one fact remains the same and remains unassailable, which is that the bedrock of reality is not isolated substances, but actually networks of relationality, relational networks. Relationships and interactions are the primary fabric of existence. So the entity encounter itself possesses, I would say, an undeniable relational gravity. It can exert a massive psychological pull on you, and it can even permanently alter your metaphysical beliefs, as we've seen, as the data demonstrate. It can change your emotional landscape and also alter your subsequent behavior. So it behaves as if it is a real relationship because at the level of relational interaction, it is one. And therefore, now I would like to begin to shift away from just asking, what are these things? And start asking, what is happening between us? What is happening in these entity encounters? And my, admittedly to some radical proposal is that what is being exchanged in these deeply immersive states is what Federico Fagin calls live information, quantum live information, which is this direct, unmediated transmission of meaning that bypasses verbal language. And in the language of value philosophy, the exchange between these agents is actually a communication of what we might call value orientation. So the entities are not just static images or even dynamic images. What they're doing is they're projecting a very specific intentional stance. They have an agenda and they have a distinct moral or spiritual weight. And they're actually trying to influence or orient your own value system as well in the process of this sort of interaction that you have with them. Now, what I'm suggesting here is actually extremely close or maybe identical to what the famous 18th century mystic visionary Emanuel Swedenborg discovered during his extensive explorations of these subtle or intermediary realms. Swedenborg concluded that within this spiritual domain, the entities are not isolated, opaque substances, but that they are literal living embodiment of what he called, quote unquote, affections. And affections are currents of desire, feeling, and motive. That's not a question, right? Okay. So in encountering a presence in these subtle realms or these aerial realms, we are being directly touched by a raw emotional vector that seeks to engage with us and potentially pull us into its sphere of influence. So if that is true, it leads us into the following conclusion. If these encounters are inherently relational, as I contend that they are, and if what is being transmitted is a profound orientation or embodiment of value structures, we cannot afford to be passive tourists in these realms. We don't just enter these realms for our own personal entertainment. We must learn how to read the intent of these presences that are before us. And then we must learn the subtle art of what I will call spiritual triaging or spiritual triage. And to understand more about this triage, I want to look for just a little bit at the philosophy of values, a field of philosophy that is known as axiology. And I want to briefly touch on the insights of a German philosopher called Max Scheler and synthesize some of his ideas with the ancient Christian conception of the nous. The nous is the contemplative organ of spiritual intuition that is known in popular circles. Sometimes it's referred to as the eye of the soul or the eye of the heart. Now, in our modern secular thinking, usually what we're taught in schools is that or in scientific programs also, is that we perceive an object in a cold, value-free way first, in a very quote unquote objective way. And then later we slap a subjective emotional label on that object or person. Value philosophy fundamentally turns this on its head by introducing the concept of valueception, which was introduced by Max Scheler. And valueception is the ability to directly apprehend the intrinsic moral or spiritual weight of a phenomenon using affective intuition, emotional intuition. And we sense this as a kind of a metaphysical fragrance or a radiance without having to rely on discursive analytical reasoning. So valueception, as Max Scheler understood it, is a precognitive sensory channel for this unmediated data. At a low level, we all have some experience with valueception, right? You walk into a room and you instantly, before being able to consciously articulate it, detect a certain amount of tension that maybe feels wrong, feels maybe threatening, or feels very friendly and inviting. Sometimes we meet a person for the very first time and they're perfectly friendly. There's nothing about their appearance or their decorum that would suggest anything that is out of place. And yet we have this instant feeling of being on guard, for example, feeling like something is off, maybe wanting to keep our distance from this person. This is essentially valueception in action, but it's operating at a relatively low level. So valueception exists on a spectrum. It can be trained and cultivated, or it can exist primarily as this sort of innate faculty that we have. So Max Shaler would say that human beings are endowed with this primal affective intuition that grasps the inherent excellence, dignity, or radiance of an object or a spiritual presence. And one of Max Shaler's students, Dietrich von Hildebrand, he beautifully describes this subjective radiance as that metaphysical fragrance that I was referring to earlier, and it's just given off by a being. It's almost like smelling their soul, the fragrance of their soul. Now, as I said, although human consciousness is innately endowed with this possibility for valueception, it is actually a skill, like learning how to play a musical instrument, for example, that needs to be intentionally cultivated and tuned through contemplative and spiritual practices. And the more trained it is, the more that our valueception is able to extend itself into the finest bandwidths and registers of experience. On the other hand, the less frequently it is used, the more that a human being falls into either what are called value inversions. This is where you perceive values in what is actually valueless or misleading. For example, you might mistake an entity that is actually very harmful. You might mistake it for being a friendly entity because it might appear to have the physical appearance of a beloved family member that you feel very close to. And you might be fooled through this sort of value inversion. Also, if we do not cultivate valueception, we can end in outright value blindness, where we lose all of our capacity to perceive, evaluate, and respond to this world of objective values, these currents or vectors of emotion and value. Now, this is again a complex topic, but I will touch on it briefly. But basically, the description of valueception that I just presented, that is founded as a major current in axiological philosophy, is completely anticipated by the ancient Christian tradition, which recognized for a very long time that the nous, that contemplative organ that I referred to earlier, is precisely the actual organ within us that performs these acts of valueception. In fact, we could say that when our valueception is elevated, trained, cultivated to its most sophisticated form through prolonged ascetic purification and prayer and awakening of the heart's faculties, it manifests as a heart-centered sense that is a kind of a mystical synesthesia, mystical synesthesia. This is something that is described extensively in the Christian tradition. The name, of course, they don't call it mystical synesthesia, but that's essentially what it is. And this is an advanced state of consciousness in which the apprehension of spiritual reality transcends the rigid boundaries of isolated sensory and cognitive channels, allowing a person to apprehend the divine holistically at a glance, as a whole, instantly. And it's driven by the integration of the spiritual senses, which are governed by the nous. And so you do not encounter isolated sensory data. Rather, you grasp this world through a single unified perception, where all of the various qualities are perceived simultaneously. So this is a kind of a state of psychosomatic and spiritual integration that allows the mystic to do things like taste goodness, feel truth, and see beauty all at once, as the nous becomes entirely transparent and translucent. It becomes responsive to these primordial value forces, these axiological forces that actually suffuse the living cosmos. This allows truth, goodness, and beauty, for example, no longer to be recognized as separate abstract categories, but to be encountered as actually seamless and interpenetrating facets of one whole reality, one integral reality. So this intrinsic link between mystical synesthesia and sophisticated valueception is really critical to the practice of spiritual discernment in the Christian tradition, what is known as diakrisis in Greek. So when an individual encounters an autonomous spiritual entity or enters into these aerial realms, And again, whether that is through classical psychedelics or near-death experiences or very profound contemplative prayer, the subject is no longer relying on logical deduction or surface level aesthetics. Does it look good? Does it seem good to my simple senses? In order to judge the value of the encounter. And this is important because, as I said, deceptive lower order entities can easily mimic light. They can appear as angels. They can fabricate highly coherent arguments, and they can flatter the ego very, very powerfully. So the visual geometry of a radiant guide that you might see, for example, under a DMT trip, is highly mercurial, highly malleable, and it's being shaped and distorted by cultural or neurological filters that are operating at a more superficial level beyond the depth that operates in terms of this cleansed nous or healed nous. So an individual must rely on this synesthetic capacity of the nous to taste the entity's underlying signature, ontological signature. And then you can discriminate between whether this presence is manifesting self-giving love, kenotic love, as we'll talk about, which is characteristic of genuine benevolent presences. And you can discriminate that from a more sticky, viscous, or ontologically hollow dissonance that usually indicates that you're in the presence of a parasitic force or a malevolent force. So this mystical synesthesia, I think, is not a perceptual anomaly or some sort of a psychedelic side effect. I think it is actually the ultimate maturation of human valueception, which restores our innate ability to directly commune with and accurately evaluate the primordial values that structure the living cosmos. So if these entities that we encounter are marked by their affections, to use a Swedenborgian term, meaning their value structures, are there any ways that we can think of a scale or a hierarchy of values that can help us out here? And here I'm deploying a simplified version of Max Shaler's hierarchy of values, which can be helpful, at least initially, as a systematic diagnostic tool to help us perhaps locate where an entity sits within the cosmic order of affections. So at the base of this hierarchy, Max Shaler puts the values of utility and pleasure. And this actually, I think, I believe maps somewhat, not perfectly, but maps somewhat onto some of the elf encounters and some of the DMT trips, where these elves are obsessed with showing off these hyperdimensional self-transforming toys and technological gadgetry. And through the lens of Shaler, we would say that instantly that these are, relatively speaking, at least in that moment, they're operating as lower order entities. And they're operating at the baseline of this value hierarchy, tapping into just human curiosity, distraction, and amusement and entertainment, but actually offering zero in terms of substantive spiritual nourishment that may permanently influence a person's value orientation. At the next level, we might have more spiritual or vitality values, and this could correspond to somewhat higher order entities that are usually experienced as guides or ancestral presences. And usually these entities are sort of bypassing or not very interested in those technological parlor tricks that the elves with their hyperdimensional toys. But they're usually communicating some direct semantic messages that have to do with love, truth, and social justice, or justice more broadly speaking. And so the proper response here from a person encountering these agents would be one of more loving attention, which recognizes that these agents are embodying slightly more elevated spiritual values. At the very apex of this pyramid is the hierarchy for Shaler, which he calls the holy. And usually experiences within this domain are characterized by sort of an overwhelming blinding experiences of brightness and light. If anyone has read the work of, oh, oh, I'm thinking of Shannon, who did, he was a cognitive psychologist who did a lot of studies with ayahuasca. And across the hundreds of his trips, his entity encounters basically evolved over time from sort of, you would say, entities that are located more at the base of this pyramid. And most of his experiences later were with completely formless presence of light that had no particular shape, but actually had a much more overwhelming metaphysical fragrance, so to speak, that had this sort of blindness, this overwhelming experience of unconditional love. And usually these experiences carry absolute noetic certainty. You're absolutely sure that what is being communicated feels more real than real. And there's a sense of maybe perhaps even a direct participation in the divine source from which all of these lower order values derive. To continue with this discussion of spiritual triage, I think we can supplement some of these insights from these value philosophers with the contemporary work of scientist Michael Levin, who's a biologist, and he's been thinking a lot about non-conventional, diverse intelligences, in this, especially in the age of AI, but also other kinds of biological forms that do not have nervous systems but exhibit intelligence. And as a result of that, he came up with this concept of the spectrum of persuadability. Basically, what Levin suggests is that we can discern the level of mind of an unconventional agent by going off of how we are forced to interact with it, or how we typically interact with that system. So if you can only interact with a system by manipulating its hardware, like some sort of a machine, it possesses probably a lower order level of mind with a low amount of agency. But if the system can be engaged through friendship, through moral appeal, through love, through bids for intimacy, then it possesses a higher agency mind. And so therefore, relation itself is a form of data collection when we have these kinds of experiences. In other words, discerning an entity requires some sort of a participatory act that is mutual. And if an entity possesses a higher agency mind, then also our response to it cannot be one of sort of consumeristic exploitation. So we cannot treat them as these sort of cosmic vending machines that we just use to mine for personal insights, or just personal psychological healing, or even to have a particularly spectacular visual experience, for example. But rather a true interaction or true relational encounter or meeting with such a high agency mind demands an egoically disinterested orientation. This is a reverential attitude that encounters the entity for its own sake, rather than what it can do for me, what it can do for the ego. I think that actually explains some of the so-called DMT blocking phenomena, which I find fascinating, which is that when some people have found, despite having very powerful entity encounters on DMT, that if they subsequently enter into the experience specifically wanting to see a particular entity because they're interested in how it looks or what it will do, they're actually actively shut out. And they might even have an overwhelmingly scary experience, or they might be put into what's called sort of a cosmic waiting room, where they're denied access to interaction with this particular high agency mind. And you would say, from the perspective of this, is that they're misjudging the spectrum of persuadability. They're interacting with this thing as if it is just simply some sort of a vending machine that you just use for your own personal purposes. Oops, did I skip a slide? Okay. Uh, okay, so how do we know if our value antenna is calibrated correctly? Are we just, how do we know that we're not being deceived by some sort of a malevolent entity that is wearing a mask of light? And I would argue that our tradition and sacred tradition in general gives us a really useful criterion, which I'm calling validation through sacrifice, or willing sacrifice. Of course, willing sacrifice, archetypally, the archetype of that is Christ on the cross. But we can talk about that some other time. But what do I mean by validation through sacrifice? Basically, any kind of a genuinely benevolent or divine or higher entity can usually be validated by its capacity to demand that we surrender something. We are called to surrender some element or fragment of our egocentrism. We might be asked to give up a long-standing grudge. We might be asked to give up a certain vice or a certain addiction that is harming ourselves and harming other people around us. A deceptive, malevolent entity almost never does that. Usually it flatters the ego, it induces spiritual pride, narcissistic inflation, and in particular, what it tends to do is to provide a false sense of some sort of elite initiation, as if I'm now becoming truly enlightened or truly awakened. There are many stories of such encounters with demonic forces in the desert traditional literature, where a monk decides to leave the community because they're now more spiritually advanced. And this usually happens through being beguiled into this by interacting with some sort of a malevolent entity. I actually believe that these various non-physical entities differentiate rather well into the traditional categories of the angelic and the demonic. And I think there's very good reason why the church developed such a sophisticated demonology and angelology, which is a kind of science that is not as accessible to us modern people. So there's this divergence in terms of this primary relational pole or the relational axis of these entities that is rooted entirely in the free will of these agents, in question. And again, going back to Losky, because every spiritual monad, every substantival agent possesses free agency, it chooses how to exercise its power. So those agents that choose to transcend the egoism and align their individual will with the supreme good attain what the Eastern Church calls deification or theosis. They enter into the angelic kingdom or the kingdom of the spirit, which is characterized by perfect love and a sort of a harmonious interlocking presence. So these are the angels in the communion of saints who act as divine co-workers in the cosmic structure. And conversely, an agent can use free will to pursue what Losky called satanic evil. And this occurs when a higher agency mind succumbs to pride and rejects harmonious communion, attempts to usurp supremacy by subjugating other agents to its own egotistical desires. And then these malevolent agencies isolate themselves into what we might call a kingdom of enmity, which operates as a kind of parasitic force. And this parasitic force seeks to dominate, manipulate, and harvest our emotional and spiritual energies, and in particularly to do so from vulnerable human subjects who might have experienced some sort of childhood trauma, for example. How am I doing in time, by the way? Okay, a little more. So I want to get a little more into an actual sort of branching tree, a decision tree. When we go into these intermediary realms and we encounter different entities, maybe this can begin to help us guide, at least to provide an initial rubric to give us some pointers for deciding, is this a benevolent presence or a malevolent presence? This is not a foolproof method, obviously, so you can go through this whole method and still make a mistake. But I think it can at least give us some initial touch points. And to be clear, the way that I put this together was by synthesizing the Christian monastic literature, which is very familiar to me, but also the psychiatric literature. So the book, the Swedenborg book that I put up on the screen earlier from Wilson Van Dusen, The Presence of Other Worlds, I highly recommend for anyone who's actively engaging in these kinds of practices to read that book. Because Van Dusen was a psychiatrist operating in California in the 70s, working with very ill psychotic patients who regularly had these kinds of entity encounters. And he did something really interesting, which is he decided to treat them as if they are ontologically real. And he found that actually that really helped. It helped him and helped his patients. And this book is just chock full of what I think are actually quite helpful insights for differentiating between benevolent and malevolent, which he also encountered in his patients. So I've synthesized the patristic literature, the Christian patristic literature, the psychiatric, and even some of the cognitive biology from people, Michael Levin, in coming up with this sort of scheme. So it goes through different levels. At the first level, the initial sorting begins with immediate direct valueception that's probably available to all of us, even without any kind of sophisticated contemplative practice. And it begins with what is the phenomenological texture of these entities or of these agents. The benevolent entities usually have some sort of a luminous presence if they're genuine higher order entities. So they radiate what Dietrich von Hildebrand called an inner splendor. There's a sense of nobility or a kind of interior excellence that commands a kind of natural reverence almost instantaneously. And they are felt to have a certain weight, a certain ontological weight. They're often felt to be more real than real, as we've heard multiple times throughout this talk. And they're usually very seamlessly suffused with this sense of unconditional love. So the texture is expansive, the texture is luminous, it is highly coherent and spacious. On the other hand, in the case of malevolent presences, their phenomenological texture is usually sticky. They're literally kind of sticky, heavy, kind of obfuscating. And they actually, calling on that sense of a mystical synesthesia, they actually give off a stench of moral disvalue often. They might have a kind of a belligerence or a kind of a banality that they often manifest. So there's this unmistakable aura of raw egotism, pride, even a kind of a ethical baseness or crudeness. So their communications might be pretty lurid. They might be laced with profanity or even just outright blasphemy in some cases. So that's the first layer. And actually, malevolent entity can easily bypass that. But generally speaking, that's the sort of the first sorting. And then the second branch evaluates how the entity comports itself in relation to our free will, to the free will of the person who's encountering this intelligence. So a beneficent presence demonstrates a very profound radical respect for our human freedom. So these higher order entities or guides act as supportive midwives of our personal insights, rather than being sort of masters of control. For example, Swedenborg noted that the influx of good spirits is always very tacit, very quiet, gentle, non-coercive, and respects human autonomy and invites a kind of a relationship of mutual respect, love, and voluntary alignment. So usually these presences will withdraw if they are frightening an individual. If the individual asks for them to withdraw, they will respect the wishes of the person and withdraw. So this relational dynamic is kenotic, respectful, and has this kind of partnering quality. And usually these entities seem to be oriented themselves toward the other, toward the person that they're interacting with, but also towards the sacred. They have this sort of vertical relationship, and they're inviting you to enter into a voluntary participation in the greater good and the beautiful or the true. On the other hand, we have the malevolent presences taking often a controlling stance. So they're usually aggressively coercive. They're very persistent. They will not let up, even if you say, even if you request that they back off. And they're highly transactional. In fact, they can act directly against the subject's will. So they could be launching these sort of psychic attacks that are trying to forcefully seize for its own parts of your own psyche. So they treat humans as objects of utility. They're often described as actually actively farming human subjects for their raw emotional energy. And at times they're driven by this undercurrent of deep hatred. So they have this dynamic that is very strictly controlling, transactional, possessive. They can embody pathological ego indulgence. pathological self-love in the Christian tradition, or philusia, which reduces the whole world to an instrument for their own gratification. That's another layer. Now we come to sort of a more ultimate trajectory of this encounter, this relational encounter. And here I want to draw a boundary between the symbolic and the diabolic, these two sort of poles. So the symbolic, which is characteristic of benevolent presences, in its original Greek meaning, symbolic means to throw together or to integrate elements. So a good presence usually acts as an integrative force. It binds together the physical and the spiritual. It creates a kind of a sense of wholeness, of a psychological coherence, and a deepened capacity for community with others and intimacy with others. So the theological direction here is integration, increased love for our neighbors, increased love for people that we've been estranged from for a long time, a greater willingness to forgive others, and a kind of overall systemic coherence that is sort of body, soul, and spirit. On the other hand, we have the diabolic. This is derived from diabolos, which means to divide, to tear apart, or to shatter. And malevolent presences or diabolic presences usually fragment the mind. They separate the individual from reality and also from others. They inflate pride. Pride also isolates a person. It makes them feel that they're part of some sort of elite and therefore are no longer interested in communing with others or sharing with others. So the direction and the drive here is toward fragmentation, narcissistic inflation, alienation, and a very distinct antisocial dimension or antisocial dissociation. And then there's another metric that I call the logos test. And this is a way of testing the intellectual depth, coherence, and the actual symbolic capacity of the communications with the agents that are before us. So on the one hand, in the case of benevolent presences, they pass the logos test. Their communication is usually logically coherent. It's intelligible. It might be paradoxical, but it is coherent, and it's deeply illuminating. It can shed a lot of light on some problem that we've struggled with in our life, some sort of a psychic conflict that we've struggled with for a very long time. And they usually communicate in universal symbols. And they exhibit this kind of transcendent wisdom that is far, far beyond our own natural cognitive capacities. So they have these telepathic transmissions, but these telepathic transmissions sort of deliver these profound, ineffable insights that give us insights into the architecture of the cosmos, into the architecture of our own psyche, and that clearly we did not derive on our own. On the other hand, lower order or deceptive entities usually fail the logos test completely. Van Dusen talks about this extensively from his experience in mental institutions. So usually they reveal themselves as deceptive, observed, or trapped in some sort of a loop. And here, actually, Swedenborg's findings are really precise. He observed that lower spirits are extremely fond of fabricating facts. If you ask them a question, they will confidently invent answers. They will cycle through conflicting opinions, and they will lie with a solemn, serious affirmation in order to trick the listener. And Swedenborg discovered that these lower order malevolent tricksters are usually intellectually limited to the human subject's own mind. So they might take on the memory of the person that is interacting with them. In other words, they're completely incapable of genuine sequential reasoning or delivering any kind of true transcendent novel wisdom that is completely beyond the individual's own subconscious capacity. Now, I do also want to say that there is as you're going through this sort of triaging process, at any point there's a kind of a neutral, morally ambiguous domain that can emerge. And this is, I would argue, this is my opinion, but this I think is the realm of the sort of a purely algorithmic or even trickster systems. So these systems are actually not inherently malicious. but they kind of mimic intelligence. And I do think they're ambiguous, but there could be some developmental disruption that occurs if an unprepared person is mistaking them for very higher order divine guides that could lead the person into some trouble. So ultimately, I think both mystical theology and these sort of various clinical evaluation protocols converge on maybe an integral singular metric, which is that an entity is judged by the fruits it bears in the subject's waking life. So on the one hand, we have a beneficent outcome. A true encounter with the positive presence leads to increased empathy, increased life satisfaction, and a lasting sense of purpose and meaning in one's life. It permanently recalibrates or reorients the individual through a prism of kind of objective morality and ethics and values, and shows the person the true weight and the impact of their kindness on other people. And it usually leads an enduring integration that is characterized by genuine humility and psychological sobriety, which is really important in the Christian tradition. On the other hand, we have a destructive outcome. And a malevolent encounter leaves a trail of psychological wreckage, dysfunction, and alienation. Systematically seeks to destroy the human conscience. It condemns the person for their weaknesses rather than lifting them up. It simultaneously inflates the ego with spiritual pride, grandiosity, and a false sense of initiation, and then isolates them from other people, of course. So I think to grasp this sort of existential contrast between these two forces, I want to imagine two radically different operations of heat. And a beneficent presence is like the sun on a spring morning. It is vast, unconditioned, and fills the world with light. It gently invites everything to grow, blossom, and unfold at its own pace, to unfold into its own unique individual wholeness without ever forcing the process. A malevolent presence is a black hole. It has a kind of a violent, parasitic, gravitational sucking pull that drags everything else into its own dark, hollow center. It extinguishes light. It shatters human freedom. It obliterates individuality in a desperate effort to satisfy its own insatiable, egoistic hunger. So when if we take these psychedelic substances that are acting as these chemical razors of the energetic volume, what we are to some extent doing is we're swamping or disabling our evolutionary reducing valve within our nervous system. But when we do this, I think we have to refuse to be passive tourists who are just looking for a sideshow or looking for an experience. We have to be anchored in this some kind of a disciplined spiritual triaging system and to do active spiritual triage. The one warning that comes up in all of the monastic tradition is do not go into a stance of passivity when you encounter these entities. You can't just immediately surrender to them and allow yourself to be a conduit because you might be a conduit for something that is not wholesome or healing. So, if what I'm saying is true and our whole cosmos and our reality is built on relational participation, then what we look for when we enter these realms to some extent shapes and influences who we're going to meet, what kinds of entities we're going to meet, and then how we respond to these encounters will, to a large extent, determine who we will become, what value structures we will internalize into ourselves, and then act out into the world. And again, I leave people with this sort of like slightly terrifying, maybe something that I think about, which is that as more and more people are entering these realms, and if they're doing so unskillfully, it could potentially be on a massive collective scale, be opening up the portals to the infusion of, let's say, influences and spiritual monads that are less than friendly into the sort of collective intermediary realm or the aerial realm. So I think there's a great benefit to what Ligari is doing in terms of trying to have these kinds of conversations and also trying to make these tools available online for, I mean, people are doing this anyways, So at least to have some kind of orientation system for how to make sense out of these experiences that, as I said, are, I mean, extremely unusual. I mean, it was interesting looking at the phenomenological reports in naturalistic field studies. Usually, the some of the sort of online reports of these encounters are just completely profanity laced because people, that's the only thing that people can think of when they first encountered them. They're just spewing, oh my God, what is this? I've never, they're not prepared for it. So having some kind of landmarks like, what you're trying to provide as a community, I think is really helpful. I will shut up now.
Hang on just a second. Somehow I've ended up not spotlighted. There we go. Um, there we go. Vlad, thank you so much. I'm sort of immediately uh, realizing that if we had heard this talk, probably if many of us had heard this talk 10 years ago, um, it may not have landed the same way. And I'm thinking about our political life and AI psychosis and all sorts of other things happening in our world. And um, and now as I hear this talk, I'm like, oh yeah, that tracks. That all tracks. um, I also first want to thank you, and then we'll turn to questions. I know there's a lot of good questions both in the chat and people have raised their hands, but um, I want to thank you for reminding us of this Christian anthropology that is, on the one hand, um, out of the tradition, out of the early tradition, but done in such a way that we can maybe get a little bit more traction with it, find our footing in it, and there are two things that it does um, that feel important to name. One is there's this quote from Paul Yevdokimov, who he says something like, "An apophatic theology needs an apophatic anthropology." So just reminding us that we need to remember that there's mystery at the heart of the human, that there's transcendence at the heart of the human, and to anchor there. And then the other piece, which we don't have in the Christian West so much, or we're really bad at it. The image really is like in the Saint Anthony story. The friends come after he's been in the desert for years, and they're surprised to discover that he looks great. He's healthy, he's glowing, he's happy, and they say he was according to his nature. He was cataphysin. Um, and those are the pieces that we struggle with in the West, to remember that we're both transcendent and that to enter into the spiritual life is to do so according to our nature, not going beyond it or above it. And so
Well,
this talk was really helpful to
uh,
orient ourselves to that.
yeah, so many things here that we could talk for hours, but yeah, what you just said about the loss of the transcendent, also in the context of some Jungians, when they will say like, well, these are just archetypes from the collective unconscious and all this kind of stuff. I always want to challenge people to at least go a further step, to at least entertain the possibility that just because an archetype emerges from the collective unconscious, let's say is immanent within the human psyche, does not mean that it does not also have a transcendent reality. And Jung himself struggled with this throughout his career. He went back and forth in terms of what is the actual ontological status of these things. But the archetype of the mother is a deep archetype. That doesn't mean that mother does not exist. That is not does not have a transcendent reality. I would say in our context, Christ is an archetype. I mean, that's how we think of him. But I would say he also has a transcendent reality, and all these things. So I'm hoping that, as we were talking a little bit earlier before everyone showed up, is that the mainstream current of intellectual thought, which has for so long been beholden to this kind of like almost an embarrassment to say that. It was like the most you could say is like maybe some sort of a watered down Jungian version, which is like, well, yeah, it could be an archetype activation. But now people are beginning to entertain different metaphysical models like panpsychism, quantum panpsychism. And they're willing to go a little bit out on a ledge and say, well, there might be a kind of a transcendent reality to these things. And again, I want to emphasize that was the perspective of all these monks and all these of our own tradition, is that they were interacting with real things, which is both, yeah, that has many elements. Some of them are terrifying, and then some of them are also sobering because it suggests that also there is no such thing as personal sin, right? So the all sin is collective sin, just like all virtue is not our own personal virtue, but it is a kind of a participation. So there's a lot to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear it's just an archetype. Well, not just, so, they'll reduce it to the psychological. Um, and it's a struggle if you're a clinician, someone is showing up generally in your scope of practice is to help them work at the psychological level. And I'm sensitive to the resistance as a clinician to say to jump to the spiritual, because actually oftentimes the work when someone has encountered the spiritual is inflated and in a way that's been destabilizing is to come back. So, I don't know what we do yet, but it's helpful to hear that it's not just an archetype, maybe ought to be retired, and we ought to think about what does it mean to act within our scope of practice with the person in front of us and why they're seeing us. And um, so let me get to some questions in the chat and up here. I think I want to start. Well, I'll go a little bit out of order. So I'll start with Ashley, who says in the chat, "I'm very interested in effective intuition or valueception. Is this similar or the same as discernment of spirits that is talked about in Christian scriptures? If so, how is this gift exercised and cultivated? And is the nous analogous to the third eye?"
Yes, the noose is an elegant. Well, is the noose like? No. The third eye traditionally is mapped to a chakra. Let's say it comes from the Vedic tradition, but it's mapped to somewhere within the head, roughly corresponding, some people say, to the pineal gland. The noose is within the heart, there is an older Far Eastern tradition that understood that. That understanding was subsequently lost, actually, within the Far East, and it migrated upwards. And this is kind of a very esoteric discussion, but there is something corresponding to the third eye in the Christian tradition. And this is what enables theoria physicae, which is the ability to perceive the inward unity of all things in the created world in God. Theoria physicae leads us to God through a sort of through creation. So it involves kind of the lifting of the falsifying veil that normally clouds our vision, allows us to see the logos that is present in all plants, minerals, animals, and all this kind of stuff. This is believed to primarily, within the Christian anthropology, to emanate from a kind of a from the subtle center of the third eye, let's say. But the nous is actually within the heart. The heart, both as a physical organ, psychological organ, and as a spiritual organ. We could do a whole course on that, which is really fascinating. So it is the eye of the heart and the eye of the soul. The third eye is slightly different. Now, the valueception and diakrisis, they're very, I would argue they're very similar. They've cropped up in completely different literatures that normally don't communicate with one another. Max Scheler's student, Dietrich von Hildebrand, was a Roman Catholic, a devoted Roman Catholic. So he very much talked about valueception, response to objective values within a sort of a Christian framework. But Max Scheler himself was not schooled in the fathers, was not, he probably would not even know what diakrisis was. But I would argue that what diakrisis is a very, again, like I said, valueception, we can think of it existing on a spectrum ranging from what we all sort of have, you kind of pick up on um, how people strike you, all that kind of stuff, to this very high-end range. So, and I'm thinking of some of the spiritual elders in the Eastern Orthodox tradition that have what's called cardiognosis. So they're able to read your heart without you even saying a single word, and to have sometimes embarrassing access to your private world and all that kind of stuff. And that's like a super form of valueception. that has not been cultivated in most of us, right? So yeah, I would argue diakrisis is a very sophisticated, very intentionally cultivated valueception. Um, and it's interesting, I mentioned sort of related, but I mentioned people with aphantasia, which is an inability to have any kind of visual imagination. They still have entity encounters when they take DMT, but it is not visual. So they have kind of a sense of a sensed presence, which sometimes they describe in very synesthetic language. So I believe they're tapping into some sort of a uncultivated form of mystical synesthesia that exists there as a seed or as a potential. I think, by the way, that opens up a fascinating field of study in phenomenology of entity encounters, which is it has been so heavily dominated by the visual modality. But how do we feel entities? How do we smell them? How do we taste them? How do we, because I do believe that we do relate in all those ways. But there's been just so much emphasis on the visual modality. Uh, this, by the way, also has to do with the heart. The heart is believed to be the central sensing presence. The heart, as it branches throughout the body, differentiates into distinct sensory channels or modalities. So then you have vision, hearing, smell, but they're actually all integrated within the heart. Like if you imagine like this the spoke of a wheel, it all comes together in the heart to enable this mystical synesthesia. And then as you go to the surface of your being and to the surface of the body, they split into separate sensory channels.
Thanks. Ashley, I really also just want to thank you for your question. There's a long history of the spiritual senses in Christianity that is quite messy and not systematized. And I think most of us, at least particularly in the West, are not aware of it. Um, in terms of even being taught or told about the various ways we can perceive God or perceive God's love or will for us beyond sort of categories of moralism. Uh,
Yep.
Michael, why don't you unmute?
Yeah, Vlad, thank you very much for the presentation. It was a little bit like drinking out of the fire hose, though. Couldn't quite get it all. But perhaps you covered this, but is there evidence that preparation and intention play into whether or not you experience a beneficent or a malevolent experience?
Certainly, I mean, that's what we often anecdotally, that's what a lot of people will report. And I think that would certainly be the understanding within also indigenous traditions, shamanistic traditions. I have some familiarity with them, but not probably as many people in this call do. But I believe that that's sort of the default position, is that your stance definitely will influence who you will encounter, right? I think there are some. I presented tricksters as sort of morally ambiguous. I think there is a class of more benevolent tricksters who will check your ego, who will basically function to dethrone a very strong know-it-all sort of ego structure. And and so if you enter with a non-reverential stance, they might just like trip you up a little bit and rub your nose in the dirt just so you have the proper respect for what you're entering into. So I think that's an interesting sort of edge case to explore. I'm not aware of. I mean, I'm sure it's sort of people like David Luke probably and others are actively investigating these questions, but I'm not aware of whether how much it has been systematically researched yet. But that's certainly that would be my expectation. Like I said, we can't treat them as cosmic vending machines. Like uh, if they really are high agency minds.
Thank you thank you very much.
Thank you.
Terry, would you like to unmute?
Well, it's been a very fascinating presentation. So much, yeah, like the other guy said, kind of drinking out of a fire hose. I myself have not had entity encounters, but yet in my deep psychedelic experiences, I've experienced all of those things that you described in your presentation. Well, there's a couple of thoughts. One, it almost sounds like you would almost be prohibiting psychedelic experience except to people who've already achieved spiritual mastery. And of course, there's no shortcut to spiritual mastery, but that takes decades. And I think, I don't know, to me, these are all potentials of the human soul, what we would call angelic, what we would call demonic. They're all potentials resident within who we are. And the question I would have that, well, what I would counsel people who are thinking of a psychedelic experience is, number one, don't do it alone. Be prepared. But then what would you feel about advice that basically when you go into that experience, you suspend all judgment? And of course, if you're not in an egoic state, you're not going to be triaging anything. I find that I have an inner wisdom from the divine that is discerning, but nonetheless, I have those experiences. But how would you feel about the idea that you suspend judgment, accept all of your experience as valid, and then sort it all out when you have your integration with a professional guide?
Thank you. That's wonderful. Again, we could spend several hours going into this. Well, the first thing I would say, I guess, is I'm not saying that one should not at all enter into these realms before they're completely enlightened, because, of course, that would be impossible. And also, by the way, so I come from the Eastern Orthodox tradition where, there's a practice of the Jesus prayer, which has been very important in our tradition. Well, if you do deep Jesus prayer with thousands of repetitions throughout the day, you're going to be entering the deep psyche like pretty quickly. You're going to have all kinds of fantasies and things coming up. You're going to be stirring those waters. You're going to be transitioning into those intermediate realms, right? And that's not, I wouldn't say like you shouldn't practice the Jesus prayer because it's potentially dangerous. Although some people go that far, but I think they're mistaken. But I would just say you have to do it with the proper level of sobriety. So sobriety, this notion of sobriety is really, really important, especially in the tradition of the Christian East, which what that connotes also is that I like a lot of what you said, most of what you said, maybe all of what you said, but one thing that I would be nervous about is any kind of like total passivity would begin to make me nervous because it suggests a sort of a loosening or a potential loss of sobriety. And I think sobriety is always screening what is coming in, doing some level of sort of, let's say, some level of like evaluation or valueception, and maybe not entering into a dialogue with something that looks potentially dangerous. So I think there's these at least two broad classes of spirituality. One is like mediums, channelers, all that kind of stuff, and they're really willing and seem like maybe not as scared as I would be to become antennas for everything that's sort of floating up there. And sometimes, who knows, that could be good. That could be some genuine good messages that come through, and there are sometimes. But also all kinds of other stuff could come through. And usually those spiritual systems or approaches also are really into ecstatic states. So it's all about becoming drunken or intoxicated with this sort of. Sometimes also it has to do with loss of ego dissolution, absorption. I just want to disappear. That spirituality is not, I think, at least within the Eastern Christian tradition, the philocalic tradition, something we would be comfortable with. There's always this notion of bringing the mind into the heart also, so that the mind regulates the heart. And that's this sort of sober attention where you're not just completely becoming a passive antenna to whatever is coming through. So it's nuanced answer. And you're right. It has to do with, a lot of it is sort of post-integration work. And I think a lot of the triaging probably happens actually after the encounter, in the days that follow the encounter, as you're speaking, hopefully, to your spiritual director or psychotherapist or whatever the case might be. And then sort of, I think there it can also be helpful. Eventually, I think many of these principles are internalized and then guide us in the moment of these encounters. They become aspects of our sort of heart intelligence. So I'm afraid I'm not answering your question in a straightforward
Well,
way.
there's several things in there, but my experience is that people don't really get into trouble by the experiences that they have, but it's more when they go to interpret those experiences. For example, many people have a ego dissolution and transcendent experience, and they have a sense of being one with God. Now they have that experience, and like you said it several times, it has a stamp of authenticity, a self-authenticating reality. It's more real than anything you've experienced up to that point. Now they come, but now the danger lies, how do they interpret that experience? Some people could go into a big ego inflation. Well, I'm God, bow down and worship me. And that would be a very pathological, very destructive, demonic sort of a thing. But the other hand, if they interpret it as, well, that was a valid experience, but I'm a drop of water in the ocean, that would be a beneficial interpretation.
One thing that I think is a gray area, and this is a much longer discussion, is what is happening with some of these experiences where the entities are performing surgery on the person. So, if you have mantids performing surgery on you or implanting things into your subtle body, um, um, that makes me a little, I want to know a little more about that because, in principle, I believe that there could be some sort of an intervention in the energetic architecture of your subtle body that is happening in these realms, that is happening during the experience, and that regardless of what the interpretation later is, might be harmful. Or you might be, if you think of that sort of funnel model of the psyche might be there might be some lasting or enduring sort of energetic reconfigurations that we have to be careful about. But you're right, a lot of it is in the interpretations then that occur sort of post experience. I don't know I don't know. I would be nervous about mantids performing surgery on me. Um,
It has not been my experience, but I have had conversations, without not entities, but I like the term in the vision was intelligences. I like that was the term was used, intelligences.
yeah,
But they were,
non-conventional
but in
intelligence.
my perception, it was not split apart from who I was. They were part of my deeper psyche.
Well, I think Lasky would agree with that. His whole thing of epistemic coordination and everything is immanent with everything. Because on one level, like the whole cosmos is a kind of a hologram. Uh, but I think then he would also say that there is still you as a person exist distinct from these things. That they have a kind of they have these intelligences have a kind of autonomy of their own and a free will of their own as well, which subjectively you might experience as uh, well. The distressing side of that would be the feeling of being taken over by something all of a sudden that wants to impose its own agenda on you without, bypass your own free will and all that kind of stuff.
That seems almost a red herring. Do they exist apart from the human nervous system? They exist to me, like where is the collective unconscious? Is there a place in the brain that could identify that's where the collective unconscious resides? And I would say no. The collective unconscious exists as potentials of the human. So in potential, only to the degree that you experience one of these things is it actually embodied right where you are, but a potential is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere.
Right, kind of a quantum superposition.
Yes.
Yeah. And I would argue that the collective unconscious, if you take that cosmopsychic map, the collective unconscious is also uh, a place in the intermediary or aerial realm. Um, I think Jung would actually, I mean, when Jung began to experience these entities that appear to him, he was certain that they had a autonomous existence apart from him. When I forget the names of some of these entities that he encountered, but he even thought that they went on and continued to have conversations and interactions like when he was not conscious of them. And anyways, I'm going
Yeah.
on tangents.
Carl Jung was ahead of his time, I think.
Yeah.
Terry, another consideration around ego inflation and interpretation is, does the person retain the autonomy to reason about their interpretation? A lot of people, when they're inflated, have lost some autonomy. So if you go to talk with them about, well, let's look at it from this position or that position, that their autonomy is actually quite limited to be able to see another perspective. So it's just another way of saying yes, interpretation, and then there are these other dimensions of how the integration is going that might limit what someone's able to do. It'd be nice if we could just go, oh, I'll just look at it a different way, and often people can't for a while. Rick.
So Vlad, I want to join with Michael and thank you very much for being with us and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.
As I heard you talking about in some of the written stuff that you presented about the malevolent entity, I was laughingly reminded of the comedian in 1950s, 60s, 70s by the name of Flip Wilson, who often said and was wont to say, "The devil made me do it." A little retort and then a brief question. I am a decided Jungian in my psychological approach, and I chafe at the phrase just archetypes. I think to identify an entity with an archetype is in and of itself to elevate the entity to some kind of transcendent place. So I'll just say, and I understand the concern with psychological reductionism. I'm not suggesting that. And my question is, Vlad, do you think that the cosmos in and of itself is conscious? And if it's conscious, how does that inform our understanding of these entities that we meet in an altered state of consciousness?
This is going to be going on YouTube. I was going to say, if we were having a beer at the pub, I would give you a true, unfiltered answer. I'll still give you a pretty true answer. Basically, well, the short answer is I don't know. Being open to sort of epistemic humility of the mystery of it all and all that kind of stuff. Currently, my own sort of perspective or bias is that yes, along with people like Federico Fagin, for example, that the cosmos is permeated with consciousness, or at least proto-consciousness. It doesn't somehow at some point emerge as, all of a sudden you have a certain conglomerate and then all of a sudden, poof, there's consciousness. I believe as he says, the quantum vacuum itself has a sort of inner dimension, or which is a dimension of the consciousness space. And then I believe that it exists as a vast hierarchy of different conglomerates of these proto-conscious units. I think our body is a particular conglomerate of these proto-consciousness units. I think there is a kind of proto-consciousness in my kidney, in my liver, in my heart. They come together to be governed under a higher order hierarchical principle, which sometimes bears the name Vlad, but is also not that. It is temporarily allowing me to live in this body and to have this particular experience. But then I'm enfolded within a much vaster hierarchy of these consciousness units. And fundamentally, I think that there's that fundamental division between the sort of the kingdom of God, of the angelic spirits, and the sort of demonic spirits. All the consciousness units that are cooperating, entering into a mode of coherence with one another. If you get me started on this, I'll never stop. But they're entering into a sort of a higher order coherence, a state of integration and harmonious flow, where they're willingly interacting with one another. They're not being coerced or being forced to do this for the sake of a greater good, for the true, the beautiful, and the good. That is the kingdom of spirits. As we enter more and more, as we gradually pass more and more into a conscious collaboration with that process, we become deified in the process. This process of theosis that we talk about in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And then there's this other tradition, which is a self-assertive, the part confusing itself for the whole. The part, for example, me thinking that I am the whole of reality and everything needs to revolve around me. And then, let's say the archetype of that is Lucifer, right? Sort of this prideful unwillingness to enter into a state of coherence and communion. And that leads to disintegration, fragmentation, languishing, and all that kind of stuff. And then we can get into, debates about Christian universalism, whether eventually the providence of God will lead all consciousness units to cooperate with the larger plan. And we're all playing our little part in this grand symphony, cosmic symphony. But it helps to, I think, also, for me, it changes the nature of the inner work that we do on ourselves, because it's no longer this is just something happening within the confines of my skull and I want to feel better, so I go see a therapist. It's like I'm on this journey. We're all on this journey of becoming conscious and becoming willing collaborators in this symphony. And therefore, the inner work has a sort of a pan-cosmic element to it.
Michael's, or Terry actually was talking about intent and setting and all that kind of stuff. And in my experience, I haven't done this, but I'm going to do this, is as I enter into this state of altered consciousness, as I'm taking the drug or the medicine or what have you, to say a prayer of, may what I learn here give me the wisdom of how to speak of what I learned here to the greater whole.
Yes, wonderful. Yeah. Are you familiar with Arthur Koestler?
I am not.
So he had this idea of holarchies, unlike hierarchies. And there are nested hierarchies that are composed of what he called each layer of this hierarchy is a holon, which is that it could be a whole in itself. And each holon, so like, the cells organize into organs. Organs cooperate with one another to keep the whole body alive and all this kind of stuff. So the body is a kind of a holarchy. And each of these units, like a single cell, an organ is a holon at a particular level. And each holon has it's a kind of a Janus-faced entity, because it has a downward looking face that wants to basically lord it over the things below it and wants to take itself as the summit of the hierarchy and say, I am the whole, right? And then there's this other willing sacrifice or willing surrender that I alluded to, where it says, I'm not the whole. I'm a small whole, but I belong to a much vaster whole. I'm going to willingly allow myself to turn to this other face and allow myself to be transcendently incorporated into I would say, the body of Christ, and become a collaborator in this vast cosmic process. And so this works at multiple different scales of organization. So you can, for example, understand tumors and cancerous cells as like a holon that has just gone awry. Similarly, the Christian passions like lust and anger and stuff like that, or particular addictions or habits that are formed that have, through a process of crystallization, take themselves to be the whole. They think the whole purpose of life is to satisfy that little local criterion of happiness, whatever the addiction is. And they completely, at the expense of the whole organism, they become these runaway processes, self-perpetuating processes, kind of like forest fires and that kind of stuff. I'm sorry, I talk a lot, but yeah, that's.
I think your mentioning of the kenotic posture in a way is your way, is an antidote to that egoism, I guess you would call it.
Absolutely, yeah, right. And it's for me, it's also like I said, we can apply it in many different scales. It's societal disorganization, global disintegration. But for me, also in terms of my own personal disintegration, the more I know about this, for me, it serves as very useful alarm flags for me internally, so that I know when a lower level hold on within me start trying to take over control, to get better and better at being able to discern that and tell it, or tell what's going on, and then make a conscious effort to shift into a kenotic stance, rather than being captured by that particular lower level pattern.
I'd love to have a beer with you and talk about the Jungian process of oh my goodness, pardon my old mind, shadow work.
Oh yeah, right.
Vis-a-vis what we've been talking about today.
Yeah.
We're going to take one more question from the chat. In an ayahuasca ceremony once, I encountered a red angel. It was beautiful, yet only at a distance. The closer I got, it seemed to feel as if it would incinerate me. Next, I was passing into a bright solar system. It was beautiful, but I had the same feeling the closer I got, I would be incinerated. It woke me up in a sense of the holy and why the prophets would say, "Woe is me." I couldn't tell if either experiences were malevolent and benevolent, but both seemed otherworldly and holy. Both experiences allowed me to leave when it felt too much. I wonder if this is a sign of holiness, the freedom of it and the humility it generated. Both had gravity.
Well, it certainly sounds like it. I mean, in terms of the fruits of, by their fruits you will know them. I would say anything that one of the things that is mentioned in the Christian monastic literature is that the demonic entities cannot stand any demonstration of humility or humbleness. Often they will be found to disintegrate as soon as the person encountering them shifts into a stance of humility, because they're not able to metabolize or digest that because it is completely contrary to their mode of operation. So I would say, generally speaking, I mean, again, this is sort of putting it broadly, but things that lead to a greater sense of humility within us, true humility, which is knowing our little place within the whole sort of cosmic drama, um, is a sign of a benevolent action, because it's the one thing that the malevolent entities cannot abide by, and sometimes that's suggested as a kind of a fail-proof method in some of the monastic literature, is that if you have visions during very deep, I'm talking about people who are doing Jesus prayer like the whole day, so they will have visions and encounters. And one of the pieces of advice in the monastic literature is, if that happens to you, always shift immediately into this sort of stance of humility, because you will give off a metaphysical fragrance that will be odious to them, to the demonic entities.
I'm also reminded that we have plenty of stories in the tradition of encounters with the holy that leave us walking with a limp. So that it's not only those things that might be malevolent, but encounters with the holy that, whether we are ready or not for them, may be too much. And just to maintain that sense of reverence and humility, whatever is in front of us. So thank you for that
Yeah,
question, David.
in the little handout I put that sometimes there can be a temporary bruising that occurs from a benevolent entity, um, which is different from the kind of bruising that occurs otherwise.
Yeah. Vlad, thank you so much for your time today and for all the preparation that went into this talk, and for helping us sort of close out and bringing a lot of the questions and threads we've been following to some quasi-resting place, or at least a platform that we can then ask some new questions from. Yeah, Vlad's email is in the chat, and then I'll also, it's in the documents that were attached to this chat, and I'll resend that when I have the recording of this. I'll also include the documents that he gave us in an email to anyone who registered. So,
Thank you, Megan, for inviting me.
all right, everyone, go in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Support the faint-hearted. Uplift the weak. Honor all people. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit and the blessing of God Almighty. Bless, preserve, and keep you this day and forever. Amen.
Amen.